At this point, we've completed the settings activity and we've made our first setting in the settings fragment using the XML. When we hit the checkbox, what Android is doing is it goes into that file and changes the value associated with the key show bas, setting it to true or false depending on whether the box is checked or not. What we need to do now is to read this from the file to update the actual app. We need to answer two questions. How and when should we read this from the file? Here's what the code looks like to read from shared preferences. First, you need to get an instance of shared preferences. In the case of preferences set by a preference screen, you can use the preference manager method called getDefaultSharedPreferences. There are other options mentioned in the notes below, but only if you want to make multiple preference files for your app other than the default one. But in our case, this is what we'll use. Next, using that shared preferences object, we can use various get methods to get data from that shared preference file. Which get method to use depends on the type of the object stored in the file. There is, for example, a get Boolean, get string set, get float, get int, and get long. Once you've decided which get method to use, you pass in the string, which is the key of the preference, and then you pass in the default value, which is basically the result of this call if that preference was not found in the file. Note that, of course, the default value always matches the type of the return of that call. Also note that there's no type checking. So if you tell share preferences to get you a long, when there's actually a string stored in there which cannot be converted to a long, the app will crash. In our case, we want to use the get Boolean, and we're going to pass in the key show bas, and we'll put in a default value of true. Now, we won't be writing directly to the share preferences in this exercise, because this is all handled in the background by the settings fragment. That said, the code for directly writing to the share preferences is very similar. Just as with reading, you'll get a reference to the share preferences. You call the edit method to get the editor object. Then, on the editor object, you can pass in the key value using the correct put type method, such as put Boolean. And then finally, you save your updates using the apply or commit. Apply is usually the right choice because it performs the update off the main thread. Now that we've got our code for interacting with the share preferences, where do we actually put it? I'm going to load out the preference of whether or not to display the bas circle right in the onCreate method. So our onCreate method calls this setUpSharedPreferences method, and inside it, I create the share preference object. This way I can pass this as the context to get the object reference, and then I can use that to get the Boolean of the show bas settings. And once I get that Boolean, I can pass it into the visualizer's view set show bas, and once I do that, I'm ready to test this. But there's one problem right now. Our visuals will only update if the activity is recreated and hence the onCreate is called. Something like a rotation would do, but it won't reflect the visuals straight away. Regardless, let's just try this out and see if it works. So I run the app, go into the settings, and I'll uncheck that. And if we go back, you can still see that the circle is there. But once you rotate the phone, the circle disappears. That's because it only loaded up the shared preferences when the onCreate was called.